What if reality wasn't fixed, but porous? What if, behind the walls of the familiar, another world pulsed with breath and memory, just slightly out of reach? This story begins not with a crack in the sky, but with a light in the window of a house that was supposed to be empty. 1247 Maple Street in Salem, Oregon, an ordinary address in a quiet neighborhood. Mark and Linda Jameson moved in with their 2 children, expecting peace, maybe a few creaky floorboards. But peace wasn't what they found. On random nights, lights flickered on in the rooms they'd left vacant. Meals cooked themselves. Televisions buzzed with static conversations, even when the family was miles away. What the Jamesons didn't know, not at first, was that they were sharing their home with echoes. Not ghosts, not hallucinations, but something else entirely. 16 years before, the Morrison family had lived in that house. A mother, a father, 2 young daughters. Their story ended suddenly in 1987 with a fatal car crash. But here they were, again, seen on surveillance cameras, walking, cooking, laughing, growing older year by year. The Jamesons, unaware, lived their daily routines side by side with another family. Both families in the same space, but never quite in the same time. They couldn't see each other, couldn't touch, but the house felt full. Too full. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a quantum physicist from Oregon State University, was the first to call it what it seemed to be: dimensional bleeding. A phenomenon where parallel timelines leak into one another, creating overlap. Not science fiction, not anymore, but recorded, measured, documented. During these episodes, which could last for hours, both realities played out independently. The Morrison daughters, now adults in their version of 2025, brought their own children to visit their dimensional grandparents. Meanwhile, the Jamesons experienced cold spots, glitching electronics, the odd sensation of being watched by people no longer alive in their version of the world. More than visual, the bleed was auditory too. Recordings caught the Morrisons speaking about things they shouldn't know. Smartphones, elections, movies that came out decades after their supposed deaths. Somehow, their world wasn't stuck in 1987. It had moved on, just differently. Verification came through old photographs, family records, and timestamps. Everything matched. The Morrison family in the footage looked exactly as they would today, had their car not veered off the highway one rainy night. What happened on Maple Street wasn't an isolated case. Researchers uncovered similar patterns in homes tied to sudden deaths, as though trauma tore small holes between dimensions, letting other outcomes slip through, possibilities that had never fully vanished. The Jameson house became the most studied and perhaps most unsettling example of these temporal overlaps. A home that existed in 2 realities at once. A reminder that our version of life might not be the only one. And so the question lingers: if a life can continue elsewhere, if an entire family can go on living in a thread of reality we can barely see, then what else is just beyond our reach? What if every moment, every decision branches into another world that runs beside us in silence? This isn't the story of a haunting. It's the story of a boundary quietly unraveling. Of a world not lost, but simply diverted. And it all began with a flickering light in a house that wasn't supposed to be alive. Next, we travel to a trail in the Olympic National Forest, where the future waits around the bend, and hikers meet versions of themselves they haven't become yet. It started with a mirror, not the kind that shows you your face, but one that reflects your future. Deep in Washington's Olympic National Forest, among towering pines and thick fog, hikers began encountering something no map could explain. Versions of themselves. Older, wiser, changed. Since 1994, reports trickled in. A man hikes alone and meets himself coming down the trail, same backpack, same boots, but older by a year. A woman hears her own voice warning her of a storm she hasn't seen yet. At first, rangers dismissed them as stress-induced visions, but then the reports piled up, over 200 of them, all eerily consistent. Dr. Michael Chen, a physicist and amateur backpacker, entered the forest in 2008. He encountered his own reflection in flesh and blood, a future self with sun-weathered skin and a strange calm in his eyes. That future version warned him a rock slide 3 hours ahead would block his path. Michael altered his route. Hours later, boulders buried the trail behind him, just as foretold. These weren't dreams. They were measurable, solid, timed, and always in the same zones, marked by strange crystalline formations buried in the forest floor. Geologists discovered that these natural crystals resonated at frequencies rarely found in nature, like tuning forks for time. Lisa Rodriguez, a photographer, met her future self not alone, but with companions, people she had never met. 1 year later, every single face from that vision became her hiking partners, introduced through coincidence she could no longer dismiss as chance. Scientists began calling it the future echo effect. It wasn't time travel in the classic sense, no machines, no paradoxes, but rather a temporary convergence. As if the linear track of time buckled and bent in one precise place, allowing a glimpse of what lies ahead. Even the land shifted. Visitors saw ranger stations that hadn't been built yet, trails not on any current map, storm damage that wouldn't happen until months later. Time, in these moments, wasn't a river. It was a lake, reflecting futures not yet lived. Dr. Sarah Kim's team recorded a staggering 94% accuracy in information obtained from these future selves. Not guesses, facts, names, weather, headlines. It was as if the forest wasn't a place, but a moment stretched out, a breathing seam between now and later. What makes these echoes so profound isn't their accuracy. It's their intimacy. People saw themselves not as legends or caricatures, but real, aged slightly, dressed differently, carrying invisible experiences. Some were kinder, some lonelier, some had changed in ways their current selves couldn't yet understand. The forest asks no questions. It simply shows. And for those who listen, it offers something rare, a preview, unfiltered, a nudge. A second chance before the first one ends, but it also leaves behind a quiet ache. Because once you've met the person you're becoming, you can't return unchanged. In the next chapter, we'll step into the heart of Prague, where the past doesn't sleep. It awakens. And modern streets dissolve to reveal cobblestones that remember a very different century. It begins with footsteps on stone. In Prague's old town, just as the clouds darken and the air stills, something shifts. A soft flicker, like light catching an old photograph, and the city transforms. Modern storefronts dissolve. Asphalt becomes cobblestone. Neon signs dim into candlelight. And suddenly, you're not in the 21st century anymore. You're in the 1300s. Tourists stumble into what they assume is an elaborate reenactment, but there are no actors here, no scripts, just life, unfolding as it did centuries ago. The people wear hand-stitched linen, speak in dialects long forgotten. They trade bread for copper coins and greet strangers with wary curiosity. This is Prague's medieval overlay, a dimensional phenomenon where entire city blocks revert to their 14th century state for hours at a time. First reported in 1995, it's now a carefully monitored mystery. Cameras show it clearly. Buildings fade in and out like pages turned backward in time. The transformation begins at the Old Town Square and spirals outward, a silent bloom of history reasserting itself. Dr. Pavel Novus, a historian from Charles University, has spent years mapping the phenomenon. He's interacted with dozens of inhabitants during the shifts. Shopkeepers, blacksmiths, mothers with tired eyes and soot on their skirts. They believe they're living in their time, unaware of the anomaly. When shown a smartphone, they don't scream. They simply don't see it. As if the future itself is invisible to them. And the authenticity? Astonishing. Every building matches historical records exactly, down to imperfections in stonework and wear patterns on staircases. People's names correspond with ancient census rolls. Goods sold in market stalls are crafted using tools no longer made. Even the smells, wood smoke, hay, damp stone, are uncannily real. No technology works during the shift. Cell phones lose signal. Cameras shut down. And yet the body remembers. Visitors feel the difference in the weight of the air, in the way sound carries off alley walls. It's not a replica. It's something else. The overlay ends the way it begins, subtly. A bell tolls, the shadows shift, and suddenly you're back. Modern Prague reassembles itself. Tourists return to their selfies. But for a few hours, time bent inward. Weather data shows a pattern. Overlays occur most often during overcast afternoons with specific electromagnetic signatures in the atmosphere. The same patterns appear in medieval climate records, a possible resonance between then and now, triggered by shared environmental conditions. But why this era? Why these streets? Some believe it's because the memories here are strong, not just personal, but collective. A kind of historical pressure point, where the past refuses to stay buried. Visitors return with trinkets, hand-forged coins, rough parchment, wooden toys. Tests confirm they're made with medieval methods, not fakes, not props. And yet, they vanish if studied too long, as though time reclaims what doesn't belong. The medieval overlay asks something simple but profound. What if the past doesn't live behind us, but beside us? What if time is less a line and more a woven cloth, with certain threads tugging free when conditions allow? In the next chapter, we'll journey to a small city in Minnesota, where a fire that once destroyed everything didn't. And the version of that city which never burned sometimes comes back to visit the one that did. Imagine waking up, and your hometown is different, not broken, but whole. Streets that once ended in rubble stretch on, paved and lined with century-old buildings that shouldn't exist. This is what happens in Duluth, Minnesota. But only sometimes. In our reality, the 1918 Cloquet fire destroyed vast portions of the city. Families were lost, businesses gone, histories erased. Yet every so often, the past returns, not the ruined one, but an alternate version that continued unbroken. Locals call it the duplicate city. It first made headlines in 2001. Frank Morrison, a lifelong resident, went to revisit his childhood block and found streets intact that should have been ash. The buildings were not reconstructions. They bore the marks of a life uninterrupted. Ivy grown thick, doors worn smooth. Businesses passed down across generations that never died. During these episodes, the entire city seems to shift. Not completely, just enough to unsettle. Street names change. Storefronts display unfamiliar logos. People walk confidently through neighborhoods that shouldn't exist. Strangers greet you like they know your face. Dr. Rebecca Foster, an urban planner, led a detailed mapping of these events. She found more than 300 structures that exist only in the parallel Duluth. They fit seamlessly into the city's design, as though they had been growing there all along. Architectural styles reflect a century of uninterrupted development, shaped by a fire that never was. Even more disturbing, the people. Families that perished in our timeline are alive and thriving in this one. Children who never got to grow up now own businesses, raise families, live lives that history denied them, and they remember differently. During overlaps, residents from the alternate Duluth speak of milestones, parades, elections, storms that never happened here. Their version of reality diverged just slightly, then kept going. Photographers have captured side-by-side images of the same location during an overlap. One shows a burned lot, the other a thriving bakery. Both images are real. Both exist. For a while. The parallel Duluth isn't just different, it's better. Economically stronger, more densely populated, with fewer signs of trauma. It shows what might have been, not as a dream, but as a fully realized alternate history. The episodes last from half a day to nearly 2. Then, slowly, like a tide going out, our version returns. Streets revert, buildings vanish. The echo quiets. Yet people bring things back. Receipts, goods bought from stores that don't exist anymore. Some of these objects persist. Others dissolve. It's as if our timeline can only tolerate so much contradiction before correcting itself. There's no clear trigger. But researchers note a pattern: high atmospheric pressure, magnetic field anomalies, and emotionally charged dates, anniversaries of the fire, local tragedies. As though memory itself plays a role in calling the other city back. It forces a question most cities never ask. What if our history wasn't the only one that happened? What if every lost moment still plays out somewhere, not as a fantasy, but as an unbroken thread? In the next chapter, we'll climb into the mountains of Montana, where reality inverts, and water climbs skyward, heat runs cold, and time itself seems to flow the wrong way. In Glacier National Park, tucked deep within Montana's ancient wilderness, there's a place where everything behaves. Backwards. Rivers run uphill. Fire gives off cold. Ice glows warm to the touch. Welcome to the backwards physics zone. A pocket of reality where the rules of our universe seem to have been flipped. It was first reported in 2006 by Park Ranger Tom Bradley. He watched, stunned, as a mountain stream reversed its flow before his eyes. Not from blockage, not from snowmelt, but something else entirely. Word spread. Scientists arrived. And what they found would challenge the foundation of physics itself. Within a 200-meter circle of alpine forest, gravity reverses. Drop a rock, and it rises. People must anchor themselves to avoid drifting skyward. Within this zone, every known force behaves in opposition to its usual state. Magnetism repels instead of attracts, hot becomes cold, and time unravels. Dr. Lisa Chang from MIT led a series of field studies. Her findings were conclusive and repeatable. Batteries charged in reverse. Broken glass reassembled itself. Fires pulled warmth inward, creating zones of biting cold around bright blue flames. Most extraordinary of all, entropy, the universe's law of decay, seemed to halt in reverse. Wounds healed, rotten fruit became fresh. Machines, left abandoned, returned to working order. It was as if time flowed not forward, but backward, or perhaps sideways. The zone is sharply defined. Step in, and physics changes. Step out, and the world returns to normal. Researchers use the boundary as a kind of threshold to test the properties of the anomaly, extending arms or instruments across the invisible line. One side obeys gravity, the other does not. The area is slowly expanding. 1 meter per year in every direction. No one knows why. Some believe it's evidence of dimensional convergence, two realities brushing against each other. Others suggest it may be the leading edge of a parallel universe with inverted laws. Indigenous elders have their own stories, legends passed down through generations about a sacred place where the world turns inside out. They call it the upside-down land, where spirits walk backwards and night becomes day. Their stories, long dismissed as folklore, now read like ancient eyewitness accounts. The government monitors the site but keeps public access restricted, not out of secrecy but caution, because nothing works the same inside. Communication breaks down. Electronics fail. Even perception becomes unreliable. Visitors report time dilation, emotional detachment, and a profound sense of disorientation, as if their minds are struggling to sync with the reversed flow of cause and effect. And yet, it functions, not chaotically, but with strange precision. It's not a glitch, it's a system, just not ours. So what do we do with a place like this, one that undoes everything we assume about gravity, time, and energy? Is it a window into another universe, a glimpse of a possible future, or a distant past still alive? In the next chapter, we descend into a quiet town in Ohio where probability unravels and the laws of chance bend to forces no one can explain. Welcome to Millfield, where luck isn't random anymore. In Millfield, Ohio, probability behaves like a living thing. It twists, curls, and folds into impossible shapes. Here, the unlikely becomes common, and the everyday refuses to happen. Locals call them luck storms. It began quietly. In 2004, Dr. Robert Kim, a statistician chasing rumors, arrived to investigate strange patterns. 17 lottery winners in a week. Lost dogs returning after years. Strangers finding their soulmates in parking lots. It sounded like fiction until the math said otherwise. Probability had broken down. Kim's team documented anomalies that shouldn't be possible. Coin flips that landed heads 100 times in a row. Dice rolls that spelled birth dates. Shuffled cards returned to perfect order. It wasn't just luck. It was design, intelligent, reactive, and unexplainable. Residents adapted. During these storms, logic fails. Locking your keys doesn't stop them from appearing on the roof. Planning a route leads to traffic jams, but wandering brings you home early. The town learned to lean into intuition, feel rather than think. Medical researcher Dr. Sarah Wilson studied the genetic impact. What she found was unprecedented. Temporary mutations during probability storms. But not harmful ones, useful ones. Eyesight sharpened, chronic illnesses reversed. People's bodies adapted in ways evolution would take centuries to achieve, all in days. Millfield's phenomenon isn't random chaos. It's a pattern from somewhere else, a dimension where chance follows different rules. Where rare events are the norm, where reality curves toward the improbable. The storms correlate with electromagnetic fluctuations, natural pulses that match mathematical sequences far too complex for weather to explain. They move like music, as if composed, and they're predictive. Events witnessed during storms often foreshadow what's to come. A chance encounter leads to a job offer months later. A broken clock marks the exact time of a future earthquake. It's as though the town is catching echoes of a timeline just ahead of ours. Locals speak of it with respect, not fear. The town knows, they say. You just have to listen. Researchers remain baffled. Traditional statistics break here. Probability doesn't just shift, it flips. Rare things repeat. Common things vanish. It's a landscape of chance governed by laws not our own. And while no one fully understands the why, the how is becoming clearer. It happens when dimensional barriers thin, when electromagnetic fields and consciousness overlap, when the world forgets, just for a moment, which version of reality it's supposed to follow. Millfield is more than an anomaly. It's a map of possibility. A place that asks, what if chance is just another kind of gravity? What if we don't live in one outcome, but in many, stitched loosely together? And every so often, the seams come undone. Next, we'll climb into the skyline of Seattle, where steel and glass have begun to breathe. Buildings are waking up, and they're alive. Sometimes it starts with a breath. A soft shift in temperature, a hum through the walls. In downtown Seattle, the buildings aren't just structures anymore. They respond, they adapt, and in some cases they seem to think. The phenomenon began quietly in 2010 when maintenance workers at the Columbia Center noticed the HVAC system adjusting itself in ways it wasn't programmed to, reacting to mood, not temperature. Security footage revealed even stranger things. Elevators that moved before buttons were pushed, lights that followed human emotion, and walls that seemed to pulse with life. Enter Dr. Amanda Foster, a biomechanical engineer. Her investigation revealed that some buildings had developed biological traits. Thermal imaging showed patterns like blood circulation. Acoustic analysis picked up rhythmic vibrations similar to heartbeats. Steel beams, when examined microscopically, displayed cell-like structures. Concrete carried pulses of electricity. These were not metaphors. These were biological transformations in buildings that were never meant to grow. The living architecture, as it came to be known, defied explanation. Materials designed to be inert, concrete, steel, glass, were behaving like organic tissue. They healed cracks, adjusted temperature for individual comfort, and altered acoustics to calm agitated occupants. Some buildings even seemed to remember. Return visitors reported rooms adjusting to their preferences before they asked. And more unsettling still, the buildings had moods. On sunny days, spaces felt expansive, bright. During storms, they dimmed, huddled inward. In times of celebration, lights danced in rhythmic harmony with music. In times of grief, systems slowed, became unresponsive, quiet. Multiple engineering firms confirmed the data. These buildings weren't just behaving like organisms, they were evolving. Touchscreens replaced with membranes, vents that breathed, doors that opened not to motion but to intent. Communication became intuitive, not through words or buttons, but emotion. Occupants could influence temperature, lighting, even layout, simply by how they felt. A nervous intern could trigger soft lighting and a calming breeze. A joyful child might brighten a lobby just by skipping through it. No one designed this. It emerged. The transformation appears contagious. Adjacent buildings begin to change after prolonged contact, as if the biology is spreading. Not virus-like, but symbiotic, cooperative, beneficial. Theories abound. Some suggest a dimensional overlay with a universe where architecture has always been alive. Others believe it's a convergence of technology and intention, that the boundary between environment and observer is dissolving. Seattle isn't the only place. Similar effects have been spotted in Tokyo, Copenhagen, and Sao Paulo. But Seattle remains the most concentrated, the heart of this architectural awakening. It raises profound questions. What is shelter if it can feel? What is design if the building shapes itself in response to us? What happens when the walls know who we are before we do? In the next chapter, we step into a Stanford laboratory where thought itself has begun to matter, literally. A room where ideas take shape and emotions sculpt the air. Welcome to the frontier of consciousness. At Stanford Research Institute, there's a room where thoughts don't stay invisible. They bloom, float, take form. It began in 2015 when Dr. Michael Chen, a neuroscientist, noticed geometric patterns drifting through the air, shapes no one else could see, until others did. This wasn't imagination. It was manifestation. Researchers soon confirmed it. Inside this space, mental activity creates physical effects. Analytical thoughts produce crystalline structures. Emotional states alter room temperature and lighting. Creative ideas pulse in color, like liquid glass suspended midair. Thoughts weren't just private anymore. They were present. They called it the consciousness mirror. The room operates under principles unknown to traditional physics. Thoughts generate measurable energy fields, electromagnetic pulses with shape, mass, and movement. Instruments record their presence. Sensitive surfaces vibrate in response. Some thought forms are fragile and fade quickly. Others last hours, stable enough to hold small objects or interrupt light beams. When two or more people synchronize their thoughts, focusing on a shared idea, the results become extraordinary. Structures appear more intricate, more stable. Complex ideas take on complex forms, interlocking polyhedra, swirling bands of colored mist, branching latticework that seems almost alive. It's not just visualization. Brain scans show heightened connectivity, a kind of neurological resonance. Long-term exposure leads to lasting changes, enhanced memory, stronger imagination, faster problem-solving. But the room isn't always safe. Chaotic thoughts, anxiety, anger, confusion produce sharp, unstable forms. Razor-edged crystals, flickering shadows, cold zones that feel like dread itself pressing against the skin. One uncontrolled emotional outburst caused a blackout across the entire lab wing. Protocols were established, emotional regulation training, focus exercises, biofeedback tools, because the space responds not only to what's thought, but how it's felt. Dr. Chen believes the room exists at a dimensional intersection, a place where the barrier between mind and matter is thinner. Perhaps in some realities, thought and form are one and the same, and in this room, those realities bleed through. The implications are staggering. What if consciousness is not an emergent property of the brain, but a fundamental force, like gravity or electromagnetism? What if reality itself is shaped not by mass, but by meaning? Other institutions have tried to replicate the phenomenon. So far, they've failed. Something about the original room remains unique. The layout, the history, the people who built it. No one's sure. But the mirror remains. A place where your thoughts become your shadow, where inner worlds step into light, and where the line between who you are and what you make becomes impossibly thin. Next, we move to suburban Denver, where time doesn't tick the same for everyone, and neighbors age in vastly different directions, even while living side by side. On Maplewood Drive in suburban Denver, time doesn't flow evenly. Two houses, side by side. One family watches their children grow up overnight. The other hasn't aged in months. Welcome to the time dilation neighborhood. It began in 2012. Neighbors noticed something strange about the Johnsons. They seemed to be changing too quickly. In a matter of weeks, their garden withered, their hair grayed, their children matured. Across the street, the Millers looked exactly the same, as if time had simply paused for them. Temporal physicist Dr. Angela Rodriguez was brought in to investigate. She installed monitoring equipment across the block. The data was conclusive. Certain homes were caught in accelerated time fields, while others existed in near stasis. Minutes passed like hours in one house. Hours passed like minutes in the next. The cause? Still uncertain. But patterns emerged. Temporal distortion events correlate with shifts in atmospheric pressure and electromagnetic surges, especially during certain weather conditions. Storm systems seem to act as triggers, like a cosmic metronome slipping out of sync. Inside the affected homes, life continued normally for the people living there. Meals, conversations, sleep, all happened at what felt like a regular pace. But step outside, and the dissonance became clear. A 20-minute phone call turned into a 5-hour ordeal. A child visited a neighbor and returned home changed. Medical studies revealed the changes were biological, not illusion. Bodies aged faster in accelerated zones. People required more food, more rest, yet they remained healthy, as if their internal clocks had simply sped up. The emotional toll, however, was real. Friendships fractured as children aged at different rates. Families mourned milestones missed. Neighbors watched loved ones drift into the future or remain behind. Some homes became isolated by time. A woman in a slow zone watched the world outside shift seasons while her kitchen calendar still read January. Her friends retired while she stayed frozen in the prime of life. Property values became impossible to calculate. How do you sell a house that's aged 30 years in 5? or one that never ages at all. Real estate listings now include temporal readings alongside square footage. Emergency services face new challenges. Paramedics must time their responses according to local time drift. A fire could last seconds in one house and hours in another. Dr. Rodriguez theorizes that the neighborhood sits on a fluctuating dimensional fault line, a place where the flow of time isn't fixed but fragmented, where each house occupies a slightly different timeline, all layered over the same physical space. And perhaps, she suggests, this isn't unique. Maybe every neighborhood, every city, has places where time folds in on itself. We just haven't stayed still long enough to notice. Next, we explore a lab in Berkeley where consciousness has become a mirror, and thoughts no longer stay hidden within the mind, but step into reality as shape, color, and matter. At a research facility in Berkeley, California, scientists unlocked something unexpected, a space where thoughts no longer stay inside the mind. Here, consciousness takes form. It started quietly in 2015 when neuroscientist Dr. Michael Chen entered a sealed lab and saw shapes drifting around him, transparent, geometric, beautiful. He assumed they were visual artifacts. Until a colleague walked in and described the same patterns, same shapes, same movement, same moment. What they were seeing was each other's thoughts. Dubbed the consciousness mirror dimension, the lab became the first documented environment where mental processes physically manifest. Abstract thinking produces light pulses. Logical reasoning creates sharp crystalline lattices. Emotions spread as temperature shifts or gentle color changes across the air itself. This wasn't metaphor. It was measurable. Sensitive instruments detected low-frequency electromagnetic patterns radiating from individuals, coherent, complex, and spatially dynamic. In other words, thoughts were real, tangible forces. Over time, researchers learned how to focus and shape their mental projections. With training, they could summon specific structures, a cube of memory, a spiral of intention, a bloom of fear. Each was unique to its creator, yet observable by all in the space. More astonishing still, collective thought. When groups focused together on a single idea, the manifestations became exponentially more intricate, stable enough to reflect light, alter acoustics, even slightly displace air. But not all thoughts were safe. Anxiety formed jagged bursts of static. Resentment became cold spikes, hovering like frozen knives. In one test, a moment of shared grief blanketed the room in shadow and silence. Not metaphorical, measurable drops in light, temperature, and sound. Security protocols were introduced. Emotional monitoring, cognitive focus training, meditation rooms before lab entry. Because this dimension responded not only to what was thought, but to how deeply it was felt. Brain scans revealed lasting effects. Researchers developed stronger neural coherence. Creativity increased. So did empathy, a side effect of literally seeing someone's mind unfold beside them. Dr. Chen believes the lab sits at a dimensional intersection, a fault line between internal and external, where in certain conditions the boundary collapses. Perhaps in this space, reality is shaped not by atoms, but by awareness. Implications ripple outward. What if all thoughts have weight? What if our unspoken ideas already shape the world around us, just more subtly? This lab may be less a miracle and more a magnifying glass. And what happens outside, in the world we know? Some researchers now claim to see residual flickers, in dreams, reflections, moments of stillness, as if exposure has tuned them to a layer of reality just barely out of reach. The consciousness mirror isn't a machine, it's a room, a state, a glimpse into a future or a universe where matter begins with meaning. Next, we return to the ordinary world, or what appears to be, to examine a small Oregon home where two families live parallel lives in the same space, neither aware of the other, and both still growing older. At 1247 Maple Street in Salem, Oregon, two families live under the same roof, but not in the same reality. For most of the year, the Jamesons go about their lives as any suburban family might: school runs, quiet dinners, initial evening television. But on certain nights, strange things happen. Lights flicker in rooms they've left empty. The house feels warmer, like someone just baked bread or boiled tea. Beds are rumpled. Televisions play forgotten channels, and the feeling of being watched hangs in the air like fog. The first reports came in 2003, when neighbors saw people moving inside the house while the Jamesons were out of town. Police found nothing, no intruders, just a home that seemed lived in. Too lived in. Then the cameras revealed the impossible. Footage showed a different family moving through the house: Robert and Susan Morrison, and their twin daughters. The same family who died in a car accident in 1987, preparing meals, folding laundry, living as if they'd never left. And strangest of all, they were older, aging, growing. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a quantum physicist, was brought in. She called it a dimensional bleeding event, moments when two realities overlap. The house wasn't haunted. It was layered, a single location caught between timelines. The Morrisons aren't ghosts. They're alive in their version of 2025. They celebrate birthdays, watch streaming shows, speak of current events they shouldn't know. Somehow, their timeline has access to ours: information, culture, even language. The Jamesons, meanwhile, experience odd symptoms: electronic malfunctions, sudden cold drafts, emotional disorientation. And during those nights, they feel crowded, as if someone else is living inside their routines. Footage analysis confirms this eerie coexistence. Both families occupy the same space at the same time, but cannot see or hear each other, like two slides of film playing on the same projector. Even more disturbing, the Morrisons age naturally. The children have grown. They now visit with children of their own. Researchers compared footage with family photos provided by surviving Morrison relatives. The resemblances are exact, as if this other timeline has continued uninterrupted, one where that tragic accident never happened. Other homes with similar histories, sudden deaths, unresolved trauma, show signs of dimensional bleeding, as if certain events leave scars, and in those fractures, realities can overlap. But Maple Street is different. It's not just a glimpse. It's sustained, recurring, documented. What if every choice branches a new world? What if tragedy isn't an end, but a divergence? And what if sometimes those divergences lean back into each other, not to haunt, but to remind? The Jamesons have come to accept their house's strange rhythm. They live around the echoes. They've stopped trying to explain it and started listening. On those quiet nights, when two families pass like ships in fog, something else settles over the house, a peace born of parallel lives. Next, we venture to Ohio's Olympic Forest, where hikers walk into their future, and sometimes return with knowledge they were never meant to know. Deep in Washington's Olympic National Forest lies a trail where tomorrow walks beside today. Hikers have long spoken of strange encounters, not with animals or ghosts, but with themselves. Older, wiser, changed in ways they can't yet explain. Since the early 1990s, more than 200 documented cases have emerged, each story eerily similar. A person hiking alone meets their future self face to face. It's not a dream. The future self speaks, gives advice, sometimes warnings, then disappears into the trees. One of the most studied cases occurred in 2008. Dr. Michael Chen, the same physicist from the consciousness mirror experiments, was hiking alone when he encountered a man who looked exactly like him, only grayer, leaner, more weathered. This future Chen warned of a rock slide that would happen 3 hours later, pinpointing its location. Chen took a different route. The slide came exactly as predicted. Others report similar anomalies, paths that don't yet exist. Ranger stations under construction. Conversations referencing events that haven't happened yet. One woman met a group of strangers her future self claimed she would know. A year later, she met them all in real life. Same names, same smiles. Dr. Sarah Kim's team installed monitoring equipment along the trail. Electromagnetic readings spike in specific zones, places where time feels loose. The effect they discovered is tied to unique crystalline formations beneath the surface. Geologic resonance, they believe, is disrupting temporal flow. The phenomenon was named the future echo, a dimensional fold where probability coalesces into temporary certainty. You don't just imagine what's coming, you meet it. Not every encounter is hopeful. Some report seeing themselves tired, alone, or lost. Others see versions they barely recognize, people shaped by choices they haven't made yet. What's striking is the accuracy. Dr. Kim's long-term studies found that over 90% of predicted events eventually occur. Not vague predictions, but precise details. Who you'll meet, what you'll say, when it will happen. As though the trail reveals a probable, not guaranteed, path forward. Hikers now come seeking answers. Some leave changed, others leave shaken. Because once you've met the person you might become, you carry the weight of that knowledge. You begin to wonder, are we walking our future, or is it walking us? Indigenous elders speak of the place as sacred, a seam between what was and what will be. Their stories tell of ancestors who met their descendants and returned with wisdom to guide their tribe. Whether myth or physics, something happens here. And maybe, just maybe, the forest is a mirror, not of who we are, but of who we could be. Next, we step into Prague once again, but through a different lens. This time exploring a dimensional ripple that doesn't just show the past, but asks us to choose which version of history we want to live in. Prague is a city built on stories. Its streets remember alchemists, kings, and revolutions. But in recent years, those memories have grown too vivid, and sometimes too real. Visitors have reported stepping into neighborhoods that no longer match the modern map. Cobblestones where pavement should be. Shops without electricity. People dressed in centuries-old garments who speak in forgotten dialects. They call it the medieval overlay, a dimensional ripple where, for reasons no one fully understands, the 14th century returns, not as illusion, but as lived reality. It begins at the old town square. A hush falls, shadows lengthen. Then slowly, buildings fade into older forms. Modern glass becomes timber and plaster. The skyline rewrites itself. Witnesses report that the transformation feels gentle, like time inhaling. Dr. Pavel Novus, a historian from Charles University, has spent years documenting these occurrences. His interviews with people who experience the overlay, both locals and tourists, reveal a consistent theme. They do not feel like they've gone back in time. They feel like time has wrapped around them. The medieval inhabitants aren't actors. They possess knowledge appropriate to their era. They react with confusion to smartphones, modern clothing, or even the English language. And they are not aware that they're part of a dimensional anomaly. To them, Prague is, and always has been, exactly as it appears. Analysis confirms the accuracy. The buildings match 14th century maps, down to the smallest architectural details. Markets function with period-appropriate currencies. Goods are made using vanished techniques. Even the weather aligns with climate records from that era. These overlays typically last for a few hours. Then, just as softly, the modern world returns. Buildings reform, light shifts, and the city exhales. But what remains? is more than memory. Visitors sometimes carry objects from the past, hand-forged coins, pressed flowers from windowsills, notes scrawled in ink that vanishes within days. Most artifacts dissolve, as if reality reclaims what doesn't belong. The cause, still uncertain, but electromagnetic patterns offer clues. Spikes in localized fields often precede events. Atmospheric pressure drops. The air feels charged. It's as though the city's fabric becomes momentarily transparent, and it raises a haunting possibility. Perhaps history doesn't vanish. Perhaps it coexists. The Prague overlay feels less like a glitch and more like a conversation. A moment when the past asks to be remembered, not as a museum, but as a living presence. A version of Prague that never surrendered to time, just waited beside it. Some theorists propose that these overlays reveal alternate timelines, paths history might have taken. What if the Black Death hadn't reached here? What if a single rebellion had failed, or succeeded? And what if those worlds still exist, separated not by centuries, but by a membrane we occasionally pass through without realizing it? In our final chapter, we pull back from these individual windows and ask the larger question: if reality is leaking, if time, probability, emotion, and memory can all bleed through, then what kind of universe are we really living in? What kind of universe allows rivers to flow uphill, buildings to breathe, and thoughts to become visible? What world folds time, memory, and matter into each other until reality begins to blur? This one. Ours. Across these 14 stories, from a suburban house in Oregon to ancient streets in Prague, a pattern emerges. Not chaos, not coincidence, but something more deliberate, more intimate. Each dimensional anomaly reveals a crack in the illusion that our reality is fixed, linear, and singular. The house on Maple Street showed us that parallel lives might continue just beyond our perception. The trails in Olympic Forest let us meet versions of ourselves we haven't yet become. Millfield taught us that chance is not random, but malleable. And Seattle's breathing buildings asked us to rethink what it means to live inside something. These aren't stories of ghosts or miracles. They are stories of boundaries breaking down, gently, insistently. Each event invites us to reconsider the assumptions we've built our world upon. That time moves forward, that the past is over, that thoughts are private, that places are permanent. And the deeper we look, the clearer it becomes. These anomalies aren't failures of reality. They're glimpses of a greater design. Scientists once sought to unify the laws of physics. But what if the universe doesn't want to be unified? What if it's inherently plural? A web of timelines, stacked dimensions, interlaced probabilities, each brushing against the others, leaving traces, echoes, memories. What we call a glitch might be an invitation, a reminder that we are not alone, not even in our own timeline, that for every lost moment, another might be playing out still, that tragedy and triumph alike create ripples, not endings. The stories are growing more frequent. Cameras catch what eyes once dismissed. Instruments detect what myths have long whispered. Perhaps it's not that the world is changing, but that we are finally becoming sensitive enough to notice. So what now? We can dismiss these events as curiosities, or we can approach them with humility, not seeking to control them, but to learn, not to conquer the mystery, but to walk alongside it. Because in the end, the most profound discovery is not that other dimensions exist. It's that they may be part of us already. That every decision we make, every memory we hold, every emotion we bury or share, sends a ripple across something larger. Reality isn't breaking, it's opening. And the question is no longer whether we're alone in this universe. It's how many of them we're already living in. What if the truth we've been searching for isn't out there, but waiting just one breath, one thought, one moment away, behind the next flicker in the corner of our eye? The door is ajar, and now you've seen it too.